Hey everyone, today I'm going to be painting up this intercessor in the scheme of the Accipiters. This particular model has been absolutely put through the ringer in terms of being repainted and stripped so many times I've almost lost count since I put him back together back in 2018, which is why I don't have a super smooth coat of paint after priming him, but that's not going to stop me, so let's get started. First, I'm going to base him with some Chaos Black Primer, and as you can see, he's pretty beat up, but that is okay. I'm not going to let it bug me. After our primer is dry, I'm going to be using some Vallejo Black here and give him a nice base coat. Be sure to use thin coats so we can retain as much detail as possible. The reason I'm going over the black primer with another black is I want everything to be consistent, and when we start adding in our yellow stripe later in the video, I'm going to be using black to essentially make the stripe, and I want everything to be, the same black. After our black is dry, I'm going to start stippling on some Eshin Gray to give more dimension to our model. Here I'm using a torn off piece of makeup wedge that I got at my local store. Just tear a little piece off, I like to use tweezers, and then load it up with some paint, wipe some of it off just so it's not loaded up with paint, and I start stippling it on the model. Trying to be fairly random here and trying not to overdo it, but this just gives some subtle texture to the armor and dimension so it's not as flat. After some stippling, I break out the brushes and add some crisp edge highlights on the sharper points on the armor and where the armor would catch the light the most on the edge. My philosophy is less is more with edge highlighting, so I don't do a ton here. Next, we're going to take some Mechanicus Gray and I'll add some more defined edge highlights. If you feel like you have done too much, it's okay. When we start adding our enamel wash, it's going to dull everything down quite a bit. This just adds a little bit of depth, which I think is important with working with a dark colored armor. Now moving on to our secondary color, I'm going to start with AK Dark Blue Gray and apply it to the helmet, shoulder pads, and the center on his power pack. When that is dry, I'm going to use the same method as the black and stipple on some highlights to create more volumetric lighting. For this, I'm using a 50-50 mix of AK Dark Blue Gray and Pro Acrylic Blue Gray, and I'm going to be mainly focusing on adding it to the upper portions of the shoulder pads and the helmet. And the same as before, doing some edge highlighting on the sharper edges. Next, we're going to take some Pro Acrylic Blue Gray and just create some scratches, small highlights, and stippling with a brush to our gray-blue portions on the armor. For the Aquila on his chest, weapon, and purity seals, I'm using this gory red to fill those in. This is a little darker red than a standard red, but later in this video I'll be adding some orange to it to have it be more pronounced against his black armor. By the way, this is just a little side note, just be aware that I have studio lights shining down on this while I paint, so while it may seem really bright, in reality everything you see is maybe a shade or two darker. Now while we have our red out, let's start building up his knee pad to a nice yellow for the stripe. You can either paint the whole knee pad and then use the black to create your stripe, as I'm going to be doing here, or you can just paint the stripe in and build it up that way. Either will work. But the idea here is to build up to our yellow and not go straight into yellow so we can try to achieve a smoother surface, rather than doing 8 layers of yellow to get nice and opaque on black. After our red is dry, let's grab some fire orange and do the same thing using thin coats. And finally finish it off with yellow. The yellow I am using here is moon yellow. Now we're going to go back to our black that we used for the power armor, and I'm going to start at the corners perpendicular to where our stripe is going to sit, and I'm going to start defining the shape. So as you can see here, I'll add some and carefully bring the edge closer to where I want the edge of the stripe to be. Now if you mess up a little bit, it's okay, just grab your yellow and just do a little fix, and with a little practice and patience it becomes easier every time you do it. Now that our stripe is done, let's add a little chipping to the edges. Here I'm using black and lightly just adding some scratches and chipping going into the yellow. I'm going to go back to our Eshin gray and just add some stippling to the black portion of the knee to bring in some of that depth back. For the leather on this model, I wanted to use a warmer tone than I usually do, so I'm using Rhinox hide and basing all the leather with that. Now it's onto the head. Now I don't like painting heads that much. I much prefer painting helmets, but that's just because I don't feel like I'm super good at the small details on heads, such as the eyes and mouth. But we're going to do just the minimum for the head here. So I'm going to base the head in Bugman's Glow, and then we're going to add the rest of the colors after our enamel wash. Now let's continue getting our base colors down using Baneblade Brown on the Purity Seal ribbons here. Then for our metal bits, I love using Iron Warriors, but any metal you have will work just fine, whether that's Leadbelcher or one of the other ones. And this is our model with the base colors on. I'm going to take a few minutes to apply the decals to the knee and shoulders, and then we can start adding in some more weathering. Now let's start with a little bit of weathering here. I'm going to be taking Pro Acryl Blue Gray and adding some scratches and chips into the decals, and then I'll be doing the same on the knee by grabbing the black that we have been using earlier. Now it's time for our bigger chips, and for this I picked up a bag of makeup sponges at my local store. We ripped a tiny piece off, as we did earlier, dipped it in Rhinox hide, got the majority of it off, and started randomly dab it onto the model here, trying to find that balance of the right amount to add without going overboard. After that's dry, I'm going to grab some Pro Acryl Blue Gray. I'm going to be going in and adding some edge highlights to our chips that we just added, just to bring in some more depth to those. I'm mainly focusing on adding these highlights to the bottom of these chips. If the light source that I've established is above the model, the light is going to catch those on the bottom edges of these chips. Now after that is done, it's time for our wash. I'm using a rough 50-50 mix here of Winter Streaking Grime and Mineral Spirits, and I'm also using a cheap brush to apply it to our model, and I'm coating the entire thing in this stuff, making sure I get complete coverage. Once it's all applied, I'm not going to waste any time in grabbing a Q-tip, dunking it into some Mineral Spirits, wiping a lot of it off so there's just a small amount on the Q-tip, and then I'm going to start working it on the model, starting taking excessive grime off with it. I try to mix up my motions with it, sometimes doing linear motions or dabbing motions. I'm trying to find that mix of different motions to get different but intentional weathering patterns, if that makes any sense. If you feel like the Q-tip can't get into certain areas of your model, just grab a cheap brush and do the same thing by dunking it into some spirits and working it in the harder to reach areas of your model. If you feel like your Q-tip gets completely covered, just grab a new one, easy peasy. Now after it's dry, which you can either let it air dry, or I like grabbing a hair dryer and blasting the shit out of it, I'm going to grab this black wash from Vallejo and do some recess shading to bring in some depth and add separation between some of our different elements on the model to make it pop just a little bit more. Let's bring in some edge highlights to our Aquila now. So going back to our gory red, we're just going to do some light highlighting on the most raised edges of the skull and the wings here. If you want, you can do the same thing to the purity seal wax as well. I want to push the highlights just a little bit more on this, so I'm going to be using some thinned down fire orange and adding some more highlights to our Aquila here. Now it's time to start working on some leather. I'm going to be using Mournfang Brown here and thinning it down quite a bit, loading a lot of the paint off of it, and I'm going to start adding in some highlights, scratches, and weathering here. I'm attempting to go super thin here, but don't feel pressured to get razor thin lines. It also helps if you have a reference photo on worn leather to aid you in your painting up your leather if you're trying to achieve a more realistic effect. Next, we're going to go to our Scrag Brown for our next layer of highlights, and using the same process as before, just adding in some more highlights to our leather. Only difference here is not being so heavy with it. Now let's move back to the head here for a second. We got our base down already and our oil wash has helped, but I'm going to be using some Reichland Flake Shade and covering all the skin on the head with it, and while that is drying, I'm going to grab some Iron Warriors and add some edge highlights on the armor to add some fresh chips into the armor. By the time that's done, our wash should be nice and dry on the head, so I'm going to grab some Cadian Flesh Shade, thin it down, and I'm going to start building up the tones on the head, trying to get the highlights on the top of the head. This part can be tricky, but I'm focusing on not applying this to the recesses and mostly trying to direct it to the top of the head so we get a nice gradient from the dark brown in the recesses and lighter towards our imaginary light source above the model. Then, using some Ushabti bone, adding in some finer highlights to the top of the head and above the eyes and the eyebrows, thinned down so it's not a stark highlight but it looks like a nice gradient. If you're worried about overdoing it, just remember to work in layers and assess after each layer dries. It's easier to add more than it is to take away, so just go slow and be patient. Now I forgot to add some metal highlights, so I'm just going to go back here and add some to the bolter. Okay, now it is rust time. If you don't want to add rust to your model, that's fine, you can just skip this step, but if you do, I'm using Dirty Down Rust here, which I've come to really like. If you do pick this stuff up, friendly reminder, just get a toothpick or something down in the bottom of the bottle to get all that sediment off the bottom. Maybe drop a stainless steel ball in there and shake the fuck out of it. Really get it mixed up good so we get the desired finish that we want. And then I'm going to start adding in fairly sparingly on our model, mainly focusing on adding it to our heavier chips that we made. Now this stuff is also water soluble, so after you apply it, you can just dip your brush in a small amount of water and you can add some streaking effects by lightly brushing over where you applied it if you want to. It's up to you. Now at this point I wanted to add some lights onto his arm here, and I wanted it to be pretty like a bright red glow. So I'm using some thinned down red and applying it on his arm button things here, flooding the whole area and a little outside of the recesses. Just like our skin, just take it slow and work in layers so we can build up to the colors to how we want them. After the red, let's move on to some thinned down orange, our fire orange as we did before, and we're going to do the same thing but not being quite as widespread as our red, working in layers and concentrating on building up our glow to be coming from the center of these little button things. Now the last step is just taking some yellow and just adding a small dot right where the center of our buttons are. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time working on this effect on this model, so this can look kind of rough here, but I like how it turned out. On the other models for this squad that are wearing helmets, I painted their eye lenses on the helmet with this same process to have their lenses be glowing red. So let's wrap up this model by working on the base. This guy is sitting on top of a 3D printed base, but I didn't want to try and get him off the base, so I'm just going to pretend like it's not there. So let's grab some AK Muddy Ground, and we're going to be applying it all over the base, around the feet, and around the skulls as well. After that is dry, let's take some Gorthar Brown and we're going to do some dry brushing over the mud to bring in some highlights. And our final dry brush highlight of Karak Stone will wrap up the mud highlights. Let's get these skulls painted, and this is a simple step. Let's just start by basing them in Brackhearth Flesh, and after that is dry, taking some AK Brown wash and applying it all over to the skulls. And just like our wash on the model, just take a Q-tip, do a very light wash reduction to bring in some of the color of our base color back as a highlight. Now, I like making my finishes to be matte. You may not want to do this step, it's entirely up to you, but I'm taking some Max Matte Varnish and applying it to have everything be consistent, except I'll avoid applying it to our metal bits just to keep the sheen there. Let's move on to our final steps, taking some AK dirt and applying it to the feet and shins of the model. Then, once that is dry, taking some AK dry mud and applying it all over our dirt, but with less coverage. And there you have it, the Space Marine chapter of the Accipiters. Thank you everyone for stopping by and checking this out. I greatly appreciate it. I'm trying to be more consistent, but life keeps getting in the way, which is fine. I'm working on the Iron Warriors tutorial now, and it should be up by tomorrow. I accidentally dropped that model after I painted it, and it went which really sucks, but it is what it is. I still got the footage for it, so we are vibing. Everyone have a great day. I hope you learned something. If not, I thank you for stopping by again. I hope this just motivates you to paint your models, and I'll be back soon. Thanks.